Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's District Administration web seminar, which is entitled Recognizing and Preventing Student Harm to Self and Others During Online Learning, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Navigate 360. Before we get started, I would like to share just a few housekeeping items with all of you today. For technical support, please use the chat panel, which you can find on the right side of your screen. Then select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message if you're having any technical issues, and I should get back to you shortly. If you don't have computer speakers or if you prefer to listen privately, please dial the phone number and access code that I'll be posting in the chat window in a few moments, so look out for that. We will also be welcoming any questions you have today with a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so by using the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom right side of your screen. Then you can send your questions to all panelists, which is the default option. If you don't see the chat or the Q&A panels, look to the right end of your screen once again, and then click on the expand triangle, which should be located directly in front of the panel name, to make sure you have access to it. Also, something I'd like to mention really quickly before we get started, if you would like to access this web seminar at a later time, the good news is that everyone who registered and who is attending today will receive an email with a link to the slide as well as the archive recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you to our speakers today. We have Dr. Dewey Cornell, who is a forensic clinical psychologist, professor of education, and director of the Youth Violence Project at the University of Virginia. We also have Scott Poland, who is a nationally certified school psychologist, professor at the College of Psychology, and the director of the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University. First, though, I would like to pass it on to Shannon Zaher, who is Marketing Director at Navigate 360, for a few brief words. Shannon, please take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. On behalf of all my colleagues at Navigate 360, I am thrilled to bring you today's webinar on recognizing and preventing student harm to self and others during online learning. It is obvious, considering the registration list for this event is over 1,000, that this is an important topic. The work today's educators are doing is exceptionally challenging, and I know you are strong, caring individuals who will persevere. I am glad Navigate 360 can bring this type of content to you so you have the additional insight and resources to help keep your students safe, regardless of whether school is in a physical building or a virtual classroom. I would like to take a brief moment. You can move the slide, Dewey. I would like to take a brief moment to share a bit about Navigate 360 so you can understand why we find so much value working with experts like Dr. Cornell and Dr. Poland. Earlier this year, Navigate 360 was formed through the synergy of 3 leading organizations in school safety. Since then, we have grown essentially 4 offerings to now more than 10. Like you, we are on a mission, and that mission is to empower communities to stay safe and thrive. We want you educators to spend your time teaching and students to spend their time learning. So we provide the expertise, solutions, and support to simplify and enhance your safety initiatives so you can focus on your true mission. Now let's get to the stars of today's webinar. Go ahead, Dewey, next slide. I'm pretty sure I could spend this entire time reviewing the achievements and accolades these 2 have garnered, and I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with their work. So I will keep the introductions brief. Plus, Stephen already gave away part of the information. So Dr. Dewey Cornell, as you know, is a forensic clinical psychologist. And in addition to the items there on the screen, he is also the developer of the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines, or CSTAG. I have had the pleasure of working very closely with Dr. Cornell as he and our team develop technology and training programs directly aligned with the CSTAG model. Dr. Scott Poland is a nationally certified school psychologist, and in addition to all those things on the screen that you see there and that Stephen mentioned, Dr. Poland also co-authored the Suicide Safer Schools Plan for the state of Texas and the Crisis Action School Toolkit Suicide for the state of Montana. He previously directed psychological services for Cypress Fairbanks ISD in Texas for 24 years and is a past president of the National Association of School Psychologists. These two are a formidable pair and have presented together on this topic of behavioral threat and suicide assessments before. And if this does not work out for them, they're also considering a side gig as a comedy team. Seriously, these two are up. And there were multiple times during the planning and preparation for this webinar that I had to rein in their witty banter. So I'm hoping you'll get to see a little bit of that today. So here's how today's webinar is going to work. We're going to start with a few slides and information sharing from Dr. Cornell and Dr. Poland. Then after about 20 minutes or so of this PowerPoint time, the two will then go off script and chat with each other about some of the important issues you are facing. Finally, they will spend some time answering your questions. So please be sure to include those in the Q&A section. If we don't get to your questions, they will provide written responses, and our team at Navigate 360 will share them with all registrants. With that, take it away, Dewey.
Okay, well, Shannon, thank you very much. As usual, you've set the bar way too high. I'm now trying to Google jokes and witty things to say that will meet your expectations, but maybe Scott can pick up for me and carry the ball as he often does. So let me just say I want to cover a little bit about the basics of threat assessment. Many of you, of course, are familiar with school threat assessment, but not everyone is. I'll talk a little bit about some of the adjustments we need to make in threat assessment under current conditions, and then I will pass the baton to Scott to talk about suicide assessment. And along the way, we want to talk a little bit about the integration of threat assessment and suicide assessment and answer your questions about that. Well, of course, threat assessment is not just a generic term that means whatever people think it means. It's really a process, a standardized matter. And in our model, the CSTAG model, we see it as a problem-solving approach to violence prevention. In which we're trying to help young people resolve problems. We do this with both assessment and intervention for students who threaten violence in some way. So even though the term is threat assessment, I think the formal term is like behavioral threat assessment and intervention, but that's kind of a mouthful. So we often just say threat assessment. But threat assessment really has three phases to prevent violence. And first is that we have a school environment where people understand the difference between snitching and seeking help, where people feel comfortable seeking help for someone who seems distressed, whether it's a classmate, a family member, a student, but someone who seems to be distressed and maybe has threatened violence or engaged in some kind of threatening behavior, and they know that they can turn to someone in the school and ask for help. And then that's where the threat assessment team comes in at step 2, the evaluation phase, where they want to do an assessment to see whether, in fact, that concern is a really serious concern, what needs to be done based on the seriousness of the threat. And then based on that assessment, the third phase is intervention, when they're going to undertake some kind of intervention to help the distressed student take protective action if need be, but it will be an individualized approach. Now, this is not a new idea. Actually, it's been 20 years since the FBI recommended that schools use threat assessment rather than profiling, and 20 years since the Secret Service in their study of school shooting also recommended that schools have threat assessment teams. Over the past 20 years, our group at the University of Virginia took those recommendations and worked with a group of local educators to come up with a model of how schools could do threat assessments in a way that would be practical, efficient, would recognize the developmental needs of our students, and to take protective action only if the threat were truly serious or substantive. And of course, you recognize, as we all do, that students make threatening statements. They may say things impulsively, and we don't want to overreact to threats that are not serious, but we certainly want to pay attention to them and do an assessment. And threats really can range from fairly innocuous statements that are jokes or figures of speech, to statements that might be expressions of anger, might be attempts to get attention or cause a disruption, certainly things we want to be concerned about. And that at the highest level, the threats in which the person really is planning and preparing to carry out a serious act of violence, those obviously are the threats we really want to identify. But we have to recognize that threats fall upon a continuum, and that our job on the threat assessment team is to figure out where those threats lie and then to take appropriate action. Now, certainly the main purpose of threat assessment is to prevent violence, but when we're doing threat assessment in schools, we have to be mindful that we're doing more than just trying to prevent violence with our young people. We want to help our troubled students. If this was a workplace setting, we might fire an employee that wasn't doing so well, but we don't have that perspective in schools. We're not going to fire our students. We're going to try to help them and help them to be successful. And to do this, we have to be careful not to avoid overreactions to student misbehavior. Now, certainly there are many examples. This is sort of my favorite example, unfortunately, of overreaction. This young man chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. And he waved it around and said, "Hey, this looks like a gun." Well, he got into some trouble for that, was suspended from school. This was seen as some kind of weapons violation under zero tolerance. And of course, from a threat assessment perspective, he's not dangerous. I like to say the only thing dangerous about a Pop-Tart is if you eat it. Well, we've also, in our age of pandemics and online learning, we are seeing some other kinds of overreactions that we need to be cautious about. You may have seen this case in the news of a young man in Louisiana who was online in his classroom, and his brother came in and tripped over something on the floor. He picked up what his little brother tripped over. It was his BB gun, and he put the BB gun up on a chair out of the way, which is certainly the appropriate thing to do. But the teacher, seeing this BB gun, became concerned that he had a weapon and contacted the police. And the next thing you knew, this boy was under investigation and was referred for expulsion for having a firearm at school. Well, of course, he wasn't at school. He was at home. And it wasn't a firearm. It was a BB gun, which is not a firearm. And so there was a very strong reaction. And there have been other cases like this in which schools have been alarmed. And now, certainly, I say we want to be vigilant. We want to check things out if we have concerns. But we need to be careful not to overreact. And in fact, this case got attention of the state attorney general. Louisiana Attorney General has decided he wants to investigate this incident, not because he's concerned about the boy, but actually because he's concerned about the school, feels that the school was violating the students' rights and overreaching by trying to enforce this policy on a 9-year-old boy in his bedroom. So if you're looking for attention from your state attorney general, this probably is a good strategy. But if you'd rather stay off the radar screen, then I think we want to be careful about reactions to student behavior that we see on the screen if there is a common sense explanation for it. Certainly we want to look if we see something violent, we see something dangerous. I'm aware that there have been cases. There was one in Chicago recently where there was a an actual physical assault, a sexual assault that was captured in an online classroom, obviously we need to be vigilant and respond to those. But we can't treat all incidents the same. We've got to have a threat assessment team to investigate. And of course, the flip side of these errors of overreaction is the fear and the worry about underreaction. And that's also why we need a threat assessment team to operate at all times to check out cases, to check out statements that students make, behaviors that are concerning, so that, in fact, we can identify cases that are truly serious. So our threat assessment program is set up to do just that. And we have a decision tree, a training program, a process that school-based teams follow to identify and resolve threats that are not serious fairly quickly and easily, and then to concentrate their efforts on threats that either can't be resolved or seem to be serious. And we've done a lot of work to refine this process and experiment with it and make sure that it's effective and flexible and efficient. Now, during the pandemic crisis, obviously we need to think about making some modifications. Our kids are under a number of different stresses, although let me say, young people are resilient. This certainly is stressful, but this does not mean that all of our kids are going to be overstressed or unable to function. They're going to be very happy to see friends. And across the country, we've got some kids who are attending school. We've got hybrid approaches. We've got a number of different approaches. And of course, that's also in flux as the pandemic conditions have changed. And again, my hat's off to the administrators who have to deal with this moving target of what's going to happen next in our schools. But our threat assessment teams still need to be available. They need to be willing to assess and gather information, even if it's through an online medium, when threats are reported. We know that there's going to be more family stress. Many families are in financial distress. I see advertisements for funding for our food bank. Our food banks are strained because of unemployment. We see domestic conflict that often is not readily detectable because people are locked up in their homes in many places. And sadly, we've seen some concerns about child abuse, again, because we don't have as many outside adult eyes on young people to identify problems before they become worse. So these are stresses, and of course, when kids return to school, there will be school stresses having to do with the health rules and the new policies that they need to follow. We've got a lot of toxic social media. I guess that's not new, but it just seems to be getting worse, and its impact on our young people. And of course, they're going to have academic needs because many of them are not learning under optimum conditions and maybe have fallen behind or need to adapt. So certainly there are stresses there that can lead students to say and do things that are concerning, that might be perceived as threatening. So certainly we need to be sensitive to that. We've got a lot of broader social concerns, and certainly concerns about racial justice, concerns about the role of law enforcement, concerns about the election. And now all of these things we might think of as adult issues, but there's a number of studies showing that they do have impact on our young people, and they do vary across from state to state. Here in Virginia, protest over Confederate statutes and flags are a very hot topic, very controversial. Other states may have other topics and other issues that they are concerned about as well. Let me just say the news is not too helpful with this. Just yesterday, Newsweek reported this story that mass shootings are 35% higher this year than last year. That kind of headline really concerns me. The reporter for this actually emailed me early yesterday morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, emailed me and said, hey, we've got this story about the increase in mass shootings. Do you want to comment on it? And I didn't see it at 5 a.m. I wasn't up by then, but when I got up and and saw that, I was kind of alarmed that they were going to send out a message that that would imply that maybe schools are seeing more shootings and restaurants are seeing more shootings, and that we're just seeing all these mass shootings. And so I looked at her database and I conferred with the reporter, and I pointed out, number one, that the definition of mass shootings did not mean mass homicides, and that it looked like the vast majority of these shootings were actually occurring in people's homes, not in public places. That's still concerning and alarming. But what we're actually seeing in this headline, and they do describe this in the article, what we're actually seeing, I think, is an increase in domestic violence, which is certainly very troubling. But it's not school shootings. School violence is not spiked due to the pandemic, but we do have more, I think, domestic violence. And we've also had, riots and protests that have generated some violence or been linked to some violence, and some shootings for those. So I know these headlines are kind of alarming, but I think it has not changed the safety of our schools and should not be misinterpreted. So how do you know that threat assessment works? We've been very concerned about making sure that threat assessment works. And so now that I've already used up all your attention span and goodwill toward hearing me, I'm going to now talk about research. And if that doesn't put you to sleep, I don't know what will. But it will make a good contrast when Scott comes on and make him look far more interesting. So let me just say a little bit about our research on threat assessment, because we do have good evidence that it works. We have a dozen studies. I'll just go through each of these studies one at a time and describe all of the statistics and results. How about that? Scott is thinking, how can I get out of this as quickly as possible? Well, I'm just going to give you a summary, of course. And what we've shown across really hundreds of schools, thousands of threats, is that student threats are not carried out. When we can do a threat assessment, we can intervene, and we don't have to overreact in a draconian, harsh way. Only about 1% of our students have been expelled. About 1% have been arrested when they've received a threat assessment. And those cases are the most serious and severe cases. We've also seen that we're able to administer discipline and legal actions without racial disparities. And this, I think, is a particularly important topic, because we have seen a lot of racial disparities in school discipline generally. We've also seen increased use of counseling in our schools and a more positive school climate, as reported by students and by teachers. This is in schools using our threat assessment model. We do see threats at all grade levels, and as you can see, from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, this chart shows us the number of threats in a sample of schools that we studied in Virginia. And as you can see, the middle grades tend to have the most number of threats. And the purple bar tells you the threats that were identified quickly as not serious threats, that were fairly easily and quickly resolved. And that's the majority of threats that we deal with. The red part are the threats that were considered serious. These were still resolved and worked out without violence occurring, but they did take a little bit more effort, and they were taken seriously, and in some cases required some protective action. Most of these were threats to fight somebody, in which it seemed that the kid wasn't really willing to back down and really was planning to get into a fight. And we know that in this particular sample, 97.5% were not attempted. 2% of the threats were attempted but averted. That is, the school authorities intervened and stopped the threat from being carried out. And in less than 1%, we had a threat carried out. And in every case, it was a fight. We didn't have any shootings or stabbings. We've not had any shootings or stabbings in our threat assessment schools. And in fact, the state of Virginia has not had a homicide in a K-12 school in more than 20 years. I'm really proud of that. I'll knock on wood. I know statistically, eventually something will happen, but we have had a long run of keeping our kids safe in schools and identifying threats and trying to prevent threats from being carried out. And I'm sure many factors contribute to that. So let me just say, in terms of disciplinary reactions, we can deal with student threats in a very differentiated manner, a graduated manner. As I said, very few of our kids reach the level of being arrested or expelled or placed in juvenile detention. Most of them are handled with remaining in school. In fact, 86% of the students who receive a threat assessment continue at their own school. We do identify some cases where it's more appropriate for them to go to an alternative school. Some kids are in a conflicted, difficult situation and decide they'd rather transfer. We have some kids who go on to homebound, but the vast majority of our students are able to continue at their school. And as I just mentioned, when we look at disciplinary outcomes, we compare white students, Black students, and Hispanic students, and we see that, in fact, there are no statistically significant differences in how they are treated by the threat assessment process. I think we can, I know we are always concerned about bias and disparities in school discipline, but I think when we take this kind of problem-solving approach, we spend time with our kids, we try to understand what the problem is, we're able to reach decisions about them that are less punitive and generate fewer disparities. Okay, I'm coming up to the end, and we're going to talk in just a minute about threats to self. Let me just emphasize that threat assessment, as it was originally designed and is mostly carried out, is focused on threats to harm other people. And but of course, we have great concern about suicide, threats to harm self, either fatally or to injure oneself. And I'm aware that some states have delegated to threat assessment teams the idea of dealing with threats to self. And so that has added to the threat assessment plate. And let me just say, we have studied this in Virginia. We've looked at thousands of cases of referred for threat assessment. And there are a few high-profile cases that everybody has seen in the news where a student was both homicidal and suicidal. But those are the extreme cases. We want to keep in mind that the vast majority of kids who are thinking about harming themselves are not planning or contemplating harming somebody else. And the vast majority of students who threaten to harm somebody else are not thinking about harming themselves as well. So, and in fact, in our study of 926 schools, only 5% of the threat cases were threats of both harming self and others. So the degree of overlap is not as great as it might appear. And consequently, we need to think about dealing with really three different groupings of cases: kids who threaten others, kids who threaten themselves, and then just a small group of overlapping cases. Well, my friend and colleague Scott Poland is the expert to talk about threats to self, and I'm going to turn this over to him to elaborate on how we can do these things together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cannell. And it's great to see you again. And I have made a lot of notes, just like I used to take notes when you taught me 7th grade history back in Texas. Now, okay, so I thought I would get a little bit of a laugh there, but we've got a really serious subject today. And let's look at the slide about an international symposium and what it said about youth suicide. And as everybody glances at that, I'm sure that this probably sounds very much like our current year. And the media seems to sensationalize. There's been a lot of increase in suicides. Statistics are often really about 2 years behind. Clusters or suicide contagion is occurring. Kids are under a lot of pressure. Guns are far too available in our homes. Well, the next slide is going to show you when that symposium was held. The symposium actually was identifying these concerns in 1910, and Dr. Freud conducted the session. So what I'm always interested in, and obviously I've been at this a long time, it's like, what's changed? What's improved? Are there trends we need to know about? And there are a couple of really exciting things to tell you today. That is, approximately 1/3 of our states require and mandate something that schools should be doing for suicide prevention. Maybe it's have a policy, maybe it's training, but at least there's a growing movement for legislation. Now, I'm going to be really honest today, and often I'm aware that even though there is a state mandate about what schools are supposed to do for suicide prevention, that doesn't necessarily mean that it gets done. There's also growing awareness of the need to have universal screening of students with regards to depression. And I'm proud to say I've been associated with Signs of Suicide for many years. They have a universal depression screening program. And I think we could argue pretty effectively mental health needs of students in the fall of 2020 are greater than ever before because of lots of issues that have had to do with the pandemic. Now let's look at another slide. Let's look at what works. So if I tuned in today, I'd want to ask what's been proven to work. What are recommendations from, the most influential organizations around the world? Well, the World Health Organization says reduce the lethal means. In America, to be honest, that means lock up the gun. Do not leave it unsecured in a home where there is a depressed and suicidal child. And increasing education. It's particularly important that physicians get involved in suicide prevention. And by the way, somehow I doubt I'm the only survivor of a suicide on our webinar today. I was 25 when my dad died by suicide. I'm a good example of somebody who never thought it could happen in my family. But if you lost a loved one to suicide, I have some idea of what you've gone through. And most suicide prevention, frankly, is driven by survivors. We need to remember the vast majority of youth suicides can be prevented. And about 2/3 of the time, the individual who died by suicide actually saw the family physician shortly before they ended their life. I know my father did. So physicians have an opportunity to be more involved in suicide prevention. And it's also critical that building principals and superintendents get behind suicide prevention. And we need to increase our mental health professionals in our schools. Too often, counselors are testing, doing clerical duties and scheduling, and school psychologists are consumed by special education assessments. We need to give both of those important professions and social workers more manpower to actually address some of these issues. And what are the challenges? That's my next slide. And there are a lot of these. We could spend the next hour on these challenges. I already talked about too few mental health professionals in our schools. There are families that sometimes will not follow through and get treatment for their suicidal child, even though that school counselor has told them it's absolutely necessary. Stigma, lack of services, lack of finances, lack of health insurance, all of those things contribute. We now know that suicide is the second leading cause of death for every kid over the age of 10. And the Center for Disease Control has identified some factors. Mental illness. When I'm aware of yet another youth suicide, I actually think of it pretty simply. Untreated or undertreated mental illness, often in combination with adverse childhood experiences, rejection from a parent, substance abusing parent, mentally ill parent, being the victim of bullying, being overwhelmed with things in their lives. So rural communities in particular, I know Shannon mentioned the Montana plan. Well, Montana is a very rural state. People have to travel a long ways to get mental health treatment. So let's go on and look at what should suicide prevention in schools actually look like. Well, it needs to be comprehensive. We need training for everybody, everyone who interacts with students. should know what to look for, what to do. Don't keep a secret. They should know the referral process in the school. I also believe strongly information should be posted on the district website. I could search the school district website, put teenage depression, youth suicide. I might be searching for myself, my friend, or my kid. And then we really need to be able to screen students for being at risk for being suicidal in our schools and refer for comprehensive assessments in the community with community-based practitioners that are well trained in suicide risk assessment and management. Parent notification is absolutely essential. I only see one possible exception. You tell me you suspect the kid is being abused, now we're calling protective services. Otherwise, our challenge is to get a supportive reaction from that student's parent. And once we have all of these things in place, now we can look at what could we put in the curriculum? What should we be teaching kids in classes about how to help themselves, how to help their friend, how to utilize national and local crisis resources, and maybe at the simplest level, every kid in our schools needs a go-to adult, somebody they trust to go to. If a kid's threatened violence towards others, or if a kid is threatened self-harm, they need those go-to adults. And I have just a couple of quotes from the field on my next slide. Dr. Jobs is revered in the suicide prevention field. What's he really saying? It's shocking that for the most part, our mental health professionals get their degrees, get their licenses, and they never really had training on suicide risk assessment and management. And Dr. Anestis wrote a book called Guns and Suicide. And what's he saying here? Separating an individual from the method they plan to use to die by suicide is the most powerful tool we have. So very important that we recognize the need for more training and to remove the lethal means. What's this mean for school personnel? You got to have some very difficult decisions. You know, Mr. Nelson, your daughter did say she knows where your gun is. Your daughter has convinced me that she might actually use it. It's imperative that you secure that gun. And I'm not questioning Mr. Nelson's right to own a gun. I'm simply saying with that right comes a responsibility. And I'd like to ask gun owners out there a simple question. Can you ever foresee a time that that gun you purchased to protect your home from intruders, could you foresee a time when it might actually make your home more dangerous? Obviously, you hope they get it. They've got a depressed, a mentally ill person residing in their very own home. So let's look at key questions that we must ask students. For 40 years, I've been asking kids the 3 questions you see on the left. Now, I've actually become a big fan of the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, but what did Kelly Posner and Columbia really do? They took those 3 questions and made them 6 questions. We have to ask, is suicide on your mind right now? Have you ever attempted before? Tell me, how would you end your life? What plan, what method have you thought of? And then we refer for a thorough assessment in the community. We notify parents, we follow up. And in particular, we need to coordinate with community professionals and hospital personnel if a student has been hospitalized. I want to be honest, lots of information that schools need, it's hidden from us, either by the parents or by the treatment providers in the community. But we need to know a few things so that we can provide appropriate supervision and structure, and maybe even doing something as simple as lessening some of the academic pressure on a kid who's just missed 7 days of school because he was in the hospital. Now let's look at the challenge a virtual suicide assessment. I'm very proud of NASP. Dewey and I have both been members for a very long time. A group met, really, Richard Lieberman and Steve Brock in particular, they have put together a comprehensive guide for schools for suicide prevention during this time of distance learning. We need to start by looking at what's the school plan for suicide prevention? What, if any, policies do we have about providing services through telehealth? And we need to know where that kid is today. And what is our plan? Maybe our internet connection goes down. Maybe the kid basically turned off his computer. How can we reach them? Are their parents in the home right now? Do we have a backup plan to be able to contact those parents? And was the student even in his home? So if we were going to call law enforcement, try to get a wellness check, we need to know absolutely the student was in their home at this address. And does the student have a private, confidential place where they can talk to us about what's really going on in their life? And do we have one more slide about virtual suicide assessment? So I've covered most of these points, but clearly being able to see the student in a video conference is preferable to just being on the other end of a telephone. Now, safety planning is incredibly important. And the ideal way to do that is sitting side by side with the student. And what are we really asking? What's got you through a suicidal crisis in a difficult time before? Internally, what do you do to calm yourself down? Externally, who can you turn to for help? And the idea is we're side by side. If it's an older student, they should be writing these things out. And please know, no suicide contracts have been sorely criticized. You're wondering why. They've been criticized because they were all about what not to do. A safety plan is all about internally and externally, what can you do to keep yourself safe? There are a couple of apps that would help us if the student is in one location, we're at a different location, and we're trying to develop a safety plan. And I was on a planning meeting with SOS Signs of Suicide, and they do have guidelines for utilizing their program during virtual learning. Now let's look at the Columbia specifically, because I want to mention it today. It's on the very next slide. The Columbia has received a great deal of traction over the last decade. What's a really good thing about the Columbia? Hospital emergency room personnel, law enforcement, they're very familiar with the Columbia. It's brief. It's only 6 direct questions. And yes, it would be good to get a very extensive history of the young person. Absolutely. But at an absolute minimum, we have to ask direct questions about thoughts, plans, previous history. Columbia is appropriate for someone of any age. It's been translated into 100 different languages. There's the website for the Columbia, and there are training videos at that website. So my very next slide starts to introduce the idea, a little bit of the intersection of my work and Dr. Cornell's work. And in asking lots of mental health professionals, do you routinely ask a suicidal student about thoughts of harming others? Some have said, yes, I always do. Some have said, no, not ever really. And as you look at the most utilized suicide screening or assessment scales, they rarely have a homicidal question on them. But I think really in today's world, with all the attention on school shootings, I think it's probably simplest just to review these questions. Is this young person, do they appear angry at somebody else? Is it somebody else's fault they're feeling this way? Are they the victim of bullying? Do they have a history of aggression? Then you should definitely ask about thoughts of harming others. And I've tried to just incorporate at least a gentle inquiry into every suicide assessment about, are you thinking of harming others? Let's look at the very next slide about safety planning. I think I pretty much covered every single one of those points, but sometimes safety plans will ask, what's your reason for living? But have you ever had a student say, I have none? I'm probably going to rephrase it, which is, something has kept you alive thus far. Let's talk about what that is. And additionally, what else can we do to help keep you safe? And I'll be honest, I'm frustrated. Kids get hospitalized, kids see private practitioners, and sometimes it was only a verbal safety plan. I believe strongly it should be a written safety plan and reviewed frequently. And if they lose it, well, let's develop a new one, or I still have my copy. What else do you want to add to it? And this next slide is about legal cases. We could spend the rest of the afternoon on this. I've been involved in more than 20 legal cases where schools got sued. The majority of them have been after a youth suicide, although several of my cases did involve school violence. But if we just stay with suicide for a moment, what are the lessons? Peer reports need to be taken seriously. I mean, let's be honest. Who knows a kid the best? A person who's been communicating with them multiple times a day for months, or a counselor who just spent 20 minutes with them. Peer reports that their friend is suicidal must be taken seriously. And it's very common for a kid to deny being suicidal. But they were in your office for a reason. Somebody suspected they were suicidal. That's why you asked them the questions. So if they denied it, how would I handle it? Mom and Dad, we had reason to suspect your son was suicidal. But when I asked him directly about this today, he indicated he was not. That as his parents, you need to know this. So let's talk bullying and suicide for a moment. That's what the majority of lawsuits are about. Some school districts have settled out of court, but in all honesty, it's an uphill battle to sue a school as a parent, as the plaintiff. But what's the research actually say? There is a strong association between bullying and suicide. Causation, we haven't been able to find that. How are you going to rule out untreated and undertreated mental illness? How are you going to rule out other adverse childhood experiences? What I hope you remember, when you know a kid is involved in bullying, whether they're the victim, whether they're the perpetrator, do not hesitate to ask them questions about hopelessness, giving up, and thoughts of suicide. And our suicide prevention procedures, they need to be followed, and parents need to be notified unless abuse is expected. In one of my cases that recently settled out of court, yes, he was a high school senior. He had just turned 18 years old. And the counselor thought, I don't have to tell his parents. Well, after his death, the case was settled out of court. So what am I recommending to you? I don't care how old that high school kid is. I recommend telling their parents. I think I have a couple of final thoughts. And let's see. Suicide screening or assessment is not a one-time event. We got to follow up. We need to all be aware of the excellent program developed by Dr. Cornell. And again, take peer reports seriously and realize it's common for a kid to deny being suicidal. And suicide prevention in our schools, it can't be site-based. When you leave it up to a building principal, it may not get done. It needs to be district-wide. And I hear all around the country, more and more fourth and fifth graders are threatening suicide. I always get the question, do I need to take it seriously? Yes, you do. I know it's frustrating. I wish they could convey their frustration and anger in another way. But if they're threatening suicide, screen them for suicide, notify their parents while we all work to improve suicide prevention efforts at the elementary school level. And I'm sorry to tell you, I've been involved in cases where kids as young as 9 years old have died by suicide. And I hope every one of you listening today will simply take a moment, find out what are the suicide prevention requirements in your state, and make sure that those are followed. And I truly believe, as the next slide says, suicide prevention is everybody's responsibility. No one can do everything, but we can all do something to prevent suicide. And I know we're going to have some questions, and I'm going to start by asking Dr. Cornell a question or two. And I guess the first one, Dewey, I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say, but how safe are our schools? How often do we have these mass shootings like we had at Parkland, not too far from where I live?
Well, thanks, Scott. I appreciate your comments. Certainly, we've had too many school shootings. One shooting is too many. But if we look objectively nationwide, the frequency of school shootings is very, very low. We do have a larger problem of shootings and gun violence generally. We've done some calculations, and for every shooting that occurs in a school, there are 1,500 shootings outside of a school in the community. If we look at the number of students who are killed in a school shooting, that's about 1 to 2% of the children who are killed outside of school shootings. So another way to look at this is if we consider how many schools have a shooting and recognize that we've got 100,000 schools, the average school can expect a shooting about every 6,000 years, a fatal shooting about every 6,000 years. So the statistics are really overwhelming that schools are very safe. They're safer than homes, safer than restaurants, safer than other public places, but they still are obviously a very serious concern. And suicide is a very serious concern. So we have to take threats seriously. We have to have safety measures in place.
And what really are the particular challenges, Dewey, for virtual threat assessment?
So virtual threat assessment doesn't change the risk factors. It doesn't change our need to be responsive, to gather information. As you point out, we may be gathering that information online. And when we do that, we need to know who we're talking to, who's in the room. We need to know the address in case we need to contact authorities. And we need to have some way to be assured that we can talk with individuals without other people maybe in the room influencing them, although there certainly is a place and time for interviews where parents are present, and we'll want to talk with parents as well as with children and other witnesses. But we can still follow our basic threat assessment procedure.
You know, Dewey, when the depressed and suicidal child, when it's handled by the school threat assessment team, what are some key factors to keep in mind? Because I'm concerned we don't want a depressed and suicidal child to ever think they're in trouble.
Yeah. So threat assessment should not be a punitive process. It's not a disciplinary process. And that really starts with educating your community and your students before you even do a threat assessment. I want the students and parents to know what threat assessment is long before their child becomes a participant or a witness to a threat assessment. We develop online educational programs. Every school threat assessment team should have tools to explain what threat assessment is, that it's focused on helping troubled students before problems escalate into violence, so that they know what to expect when that happens. And when it does happen, if they haven't been advised and aren't aware of what threat assessment is about, we need to explain it to them.
All right. Now, do you have any questions for me?
Well, I was interested in that conference that you held back in 1910. Were you the lead speaker or the follow-up speaker? I read about that in the history books.
Very good. Very
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, well, this is very, very helpful information. I know some of our folks in the audience may have questions, and let me just check in. I can't see the chat board, but Shannon, if you if you see that there's a key question that has come up, please jump in with that, because I want to make sure we answer not just my questions, but everyone else's questions as well.
And I wanted to just say quickly that suicide rates in America in 2018 were the highest in 50 years. And now we have a pandemic. So what kids might be most at risk now? I would say those with a previous history of mental illness, those that sadly lost a loved one because of the virus. And I know recent surveys have said 1 out of every 3 of us actually knows somebody who died from the virus. And the third thing I think we have to recognize is that more kids are living in poverty now than ever before because of the financial hardships brought on by the virus.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I think the risk factors for threatening to harm others and threatening to harm self are really very similar in terms of adverse child experiences and the stresses that the pandemic is putting on us. I think the difference is, though, is to the extent that the person feels that they're hopeless and that their life really isn't worth pursuing. And of course, we want to give kids hope. And there's a lot of people who aren't feeling hope because, you know, as it goes on and we experience the fatigue of this crisis ongoing and ongoing, kids are going to give up hope. And so I, you know, in talking to students and talking to my friends, I talk about, look, we're making progress. There is a vaccine coming. We are going to overcome this and life is going to be better. But we need to have a mindset that this is going to take a while to achieve.
Thank you, guys. So we do have a number of questions here, and there's no way we're going to get to them all. I'm going to ask the one here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Scott so he can manage the time, because I know that we have some time constraints. So one of the questions, though, is, are there times that a school would run a behavioral threat and suicide assessments? Would they run them together? Would they run one and not another? How would that look?
Yeah.
Well, I think we can both weigh in on this. Generally, I have felt a suicide assessment is best done with one person with the student, a good listener, somebody who's empathetic. And, you know, it's really important, just the way we approach a kid. If I were to say, now I know you're not thinking about suicide, well, they're not going to tell me anything. It should really be, you wouldn't be the first kid to have these thoughts. There's help available. I'm here for you every step of the way. So I know when Dew and I talked previously, we want to make sure a kid doesn't feel like grilled about thoughts of harming self or others. But I think that's especially important to hopefully have a one-on-one confidential setting where the school staff member is truly listening to what's going on in this student's life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Scott. And really the same is true for a threat assessment. I mean, there may be a team collecting information and reviewing information and trying to come to conclusions, but you really want, in the serious cases, you want one staff member who is going to do a mental health assessment of that student, try to understand what's going on with them, and get their perspective, the student's perspective on the situation. So we want that to be one person, the person that we think is really best at working with that child to do that. And when it's a suicide assessment, let's say we started out as a threat assessment and we discovered that there was a suicide assessment, then we want to add the suicide assessment to the process as part of our response. And again, we never want kids to feel grilled. We don't want a group meeting, bringing somebody in for interrogation, anything like that. I think this needs to be done one-on-one as much as possible. And the team is there to consult, share ideas, and bring in resources for the student.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you guys for your presentation and for answering the questions. Now we are at the top of the hour here, and I see that a lot of our attendees submitted a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to today. That's no problem. Team at Navigate 360 should be getting back to all of your questions, as well as Dewey and Scott. So don't worry about that. So with that, I'd just like to say to both of you, Scott and Dewey, thank you for your insights. We really appreciate your time here today and sharing your experience with us on such an important topic, for sure. And I would also like to thank our attendees for joining us today. For those who enjoyed our presentation, there are many more upcoming web seminars like this one that are provided by District Administration, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news as well as trends, in addition to current issues that are happening in K-12 today. Our wide range of readers at District Administration subscribe for free to our magazine, and they stay up to date with us through our print magazine, like I just mentioned, in addition to the digital edition of that magazine, our newsletters, which includes DA Daily, in addition to many others, and our web seminars like this one. Also, for those of you who would like to watch this web seminar again, or for those of you who believe that the solutions provided today would be really helpful to your colleagues, then you will be pleased to know that there will be an archive recording of this web seminar, and will be available at the URL provided on your screen here. You can also expect to receive an email from our team here at District Administration at some point tomorrow, which will include a link to all of the slides that you saw here today. And with that, on behalf of District Administration, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone, and have a great school year. Take care, be well, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Great job, Scott.
Thank you.
Nice. Nicely
you.
done, you two. I think you both nailed each other really well. I love it.
My
I
pleasure.
love the 1910 comment. That was good.
Take care.
He started it. He said I was a 7th grade history teacher.
Yes, he did. He did.
All right.
That was fantastic.
Scott's